What if the most dangerous predators in the universe didn't want to kill us, but to hire us? What if the fatal assumption they all made wasn't that we were weak, but that we were sane? You've probably felt it in your own life, that feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood. You pour your heart, your soul, your mind into something, only to have the world look back at you with a blank stare, completely missing the point. Ever wondered why your effort doesn't always equal the results you expect? It's a uniquely human frustration, the feeling that our greatest strengths are invisible to others, dismissed as quirks or flaws. We live in a world, a society that rewards conformity, that trims the edges off of anything strange or unpredictable. And we carry the quiet weight of that judgment, the fear that our true potential, the spark within, will never be recognized, let alone valued. We are told to be logical, to be efficient, to follow the rules laid down by those who came before. But what if the very things we've been taught to suppress, our chaos, our irrationality, our stubborn, illogical hope, were the very qualities the universe was waiting for? This is the story of how we found out. It's the story of how humanity, the galactic equivalent of a noisy, unpredictable, and fragile-looking creature, earned the respect of a species that embodies pure, predatory perfection. This isn't just a tale of space battles and alien technology. It's a deep dive into what it truly means to be human, and how our greatest perceived weaknesses became the most sought-after weapon in the galaxy. By the end of this journey, you won't just see humanity in a new light. You will see yourself, and that strange, brilliant spark you carry inside, as the universe-altering force it truly is. We are going to rebuild the way you see human potential, not with theory, but with the story of how it was proven on the grandest stage imaginable. The first time we met the Cathar, we thought it was the end. And to be fair, that's what everyone thought. The Galactic Consortium, that sprawling, bureaucratic empire of 1,000 different species, had protocols for this. First Contact Package 7 Gamma, the apex predator encounter. It was a document written in fear, a guide to placating, appeasing, and if all else failed, dying with a measure of dignity before a species whose entire biology and culture were perfected instruments of the hunt. The Cathar were legends, whispered about in the data streams of deep space traders. They were colossal beings, a fusion of obsidian-like carapace and sinewy, powerful muscle, moving with a silence that defied their size. They didn't build sprawling empires, they carved out territories. They didn't engage in diplomacy, they issued challenges. Their ships weren't elegant vessels of exploration. They were shark-like extensions of their predatory will, designed for one purpose, to close the distance and kill. They were the embodiment of genetic superiority, evolution's final, brutal answer to the question of who gets to survive. So when a Cathar Executioner-class vessel, a sliver of midnight that blotted out the stars, appeared over the human colony on Kepler 186f, the consortium sent condolences. They allocated resources for refugee processing. They began the paperwork to declare the system a Cathar hunting ground, a dead zone for the next 1,000 years. They followed their protocol. The humans on Kepler 186f did not. They couldn't. They were miners, atmospheric processors, and terraformers, engineers and blue-collar workers, not soldiers. They had one barely armed planetary defense cannon, fondly nicknamed the Old Grumble because it misfired more than it shot, and a fleet of repurposed asteroid haulers that smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. The Cathar ship hung in orbit, a predator tasting the air, and sent a single, simple transmission in 1,000 languages, a mathematically pure broadcast that needed no translation. Present your champion. We will test your world's strength. The consortium protocol was clear. Sacrifice a token warrior, show deference, and pray for a quick end. The colony governor, a former drill foreman named Anya Sharma, read the protocol, then she looked at the faces of the 50,000 souls under her care. She saw fear, yes, but underneath it, she saw the stubborn, grease-stained grit of people who had spent their lives fixing the unfixable. She saw human ingenuity. So she broadcast a reply that sent ripples of disbelief across the entire consortium. "We're a bit busy right now," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Our primary atmospheric condenser just went on the fritz. Send us a diagnostic team and we can talk." Silence. For 12 agonizing hours, the Cathar ship simply floated there. The consortium was apoplectic. They called it suicide, an insult of galactic proportions. But on Kepler 186f, something else was happening. Anya Sharma hadn't been lying. The condenser, the machine that made the planet breathable, was indeed failing, but it wasn't an accident. A team of her best engineers had deliberately sabotaged a secondary plasma conduit, creating a cascade failure they knew how to fix, but which would look catastrophic to any outside observer. They didn't present a warrior. They presented a problem. A complex, messy, and utterly mundane technical problem. They had received a challenge of strength and replied with a work order. It was the single most illogical, insane, and brilliantly human thing anyone could have done. And it was the first time a Cathar had ever been confused. This single act of defiance, not of arms but of expectation, was the first win. It was the moment the predator paused, tilted its head, and thought, for the very first time, what kind of prey is this? This initial encounter became the bedrock of everything that followed. The Cathar didn't destroy Kepler 186f. They didn't even respond to Anya Sharma's audacious request for a diagnostic team. Instead, they dispatched a small, unmanned probe. It wasn't a weapon, it was an eye. It silently descended into the planet's atmosphere and positioned itself over the failing atmospheric condenser, its sensors drinking in every detail of the human response. And what it saw must have been a symphony of glorious, unadulterated chaos. The Cathar, a species of ultimate predators, valued efficiency above all else. Their technology was seamless, grown, not built. Their warriors trained in silent, deadly katas perfected over millennia. Their society was a silent, lethal pyramid of strength. What their probe witnessed was the antithesis of their entire existence. It saw humans yelling at each other over comms channels, arguing about torque ratios and plasma flow. It saw an engineer, a man named Dave, use a roll of what the probe's analyzers identified as adhesive-backed polymer sheeting, duct tape, to temporarily patch a coolant leak that was spraying neon green fluid everywhere. It registered the sound of loud, rhythmic music with a pounding beat blasting from speakers someone had jury-rigged to a power conduit. The probe's report, later decrypted by a very nervous consortium intelligence team, was likely a string of analytical contradictions. The subjects exhibit high-stress vocalizations, yet their performance improves. They apply primitive materials to complex systems with statistically improbable success. Their command structure appears decentralized and based on momentary shouted assertions of expertise. The Cathar, this was madness. A problem on one of their ships would be addressed by the designated specialist who would perform their function in silence and isolation. If they failed, they would be culled. There was no collaboration, no argument, no improvisation. There was only the perfect execution of a known solution. But the humans, they swarmed the problem like ants. They tried things that shouldn't have worked. They jury-rigged, they bypassed, they hammered on components with wrenches while cursing creatively. And after 72 hours of this frantic, noisy, and utterly inefficient-looking activity, the atmospheric condenser roared back to life. Stronger than before, with 3 new, undocumented modifications that actually improved its overall energy consumption. The Cathar probe watched for another full day, then silently ascended and returned to the waiting warship. The ship lingered for one more cycle, a silent black dagger in the sky, and then, without another word, it turned and vanished into the void. It didn't attack, it didn't commend, it simply left. Kepler 186f was spared. The Galactic Consortium logged it as an anomaly, a predator's whim. They couldn't have been more wrong. For the Cathar, it wasn't a whim. It was the discovery of a new species of life. Not prey, not a rival predator, something else, something they had no name for. This event laid the groundwork for a new understanding. We began to see that the Cathar weren't evil. They weren't conquerors in the human sense of the word. They didn't want our territory or our resources. They were the ultimate purists of evolution. They saw the galaxy as a crucible, a testing ground where life was meant to be hardened and perfected through conflict. Their philosophy was simple. A species that could not defend itself did not deserve to exist. A species that relied on treaties, on bureaucracy, on the flimsy promises of others, was a weak bloodline polluting the cosmic gene pool. They tested everyone. The lumbering, silicon-based Grawl, the crystalline Xylos, the psionic Caliph, all were tested and most were found wanting. They were predictable. They fought with honor, with logic, with tactics that could be analyzed and countered. They were playing chess. But humanity, as demonstrated on Kepler 186f, wasn't playing chess. We were playing poker with a deck we'd made ourselves, inventing new rules as we went along. This baffling display of problem-solving was, to the Cathar, a new and fascinating form of strength. It was a survival trait they had never encountered. Their respect wasn't born from fear of our weapons, but from a dawning fascination with our minds. The true test, the moment that elevated humanity from a curious anomaly to an essential asset, came decades later. The galaxy became aware of a new threat, one that even the Cathar couldn't simply hunt and kill. It wasn't an empire or a fleet. It was a plague. The consortium called it the phage. It was a techno-organic virus, a swarm of microscopic machines that infected technology. It didn't just disable a ship, it assimilated it. It rewrote its core programming, twisted its physical structure, and turned it into a grotesque, weaponized puppet of the swarm. A fleet infected by the phage would, in a matter of hours, turn on its own allies, its weapons firing with a newfound, horrifying malevolence. The phage was a logical plague. It spread through data transmissions, through physical contact, through shared energy conduits. It analyzed and adapted. It learned. It was as relentless and efficient as the Cathar themselves, but without a central intelligence to challenge or a body to kill. The Cathar fought it with their signature, brutal efficiency. They would identify an infected system and sterilize it, destroying every ship, every station, every piece of technology, infected or not. It was the only logical solution, cut off the limb to save the body, but the phage was always one step ahead. It was a fire they couldn't stamp out because it was spreading on the wind. For the first time in their recorded history, the Cathar were losing. Their purity was their weakness. Their ships were so perfectly integrated, a single phage particle could unravel an entire battle group. Their tactics were so precise, they were predictable to the phage's adaptive algorithms. It was during the disastrous Second Battle of the Crimson Veil that everything changed. A combined fleet of the Galactic Consortium and a Cathar warpact was attempting to reclaim a vital starforge from the phage. The battle was a catastrophe. The phage-infected ships, monstrous parodies of their former selves, were using tactics that were illogical but devastatingly effective. They would intentionally overload their own reactors, turning their ships into dirty bombs. They would sacrifice a capital ship just to spread the virus to a dozen Cathar cruisers. The Allied fleet was being decimated by an enemy that didn't care about its own survival. And in the middle of this chaos was a small human expeditionary force. Commanded by Admiral John Jack Corrigan, a man known for his unorthodox methods, the human fleet was a joke by consortium standards. It was a motley collection of outdated frigates, retrofitted colony ships, and one massive, ugly vessel called the Bucket, which was, in essence, a flying scrapyard and mobile factory. While the Cathar and consortium ships were being systematically infected and turned, the human ships were mostly fine. A Cathar warlord, Vrak, one of the most decorated hunters of his generation, watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Silent Talon, as the battle turned against them. He saw his own ships, paragons of technological perfection, fall silent one by one as the phage took hold. Then he saw the Bucket. The human ship was under attack by 3 phage-infected destroyers. Its shields were failing, but it wasn't trying to run. Instead, its external fabrication arms were moving frantically, welding massive plates of raw, unrefined asteroid iron onto its own hull. It was literally putting on a suit of scrap metal armor, crude and ugly. Then it did something that broke every law of naval warfare. It vented its primary coolant reserves, creating a massive, super-chilled cloud of gas directly in its path. The phage ships, expecting a last, desperate energy weapon barrage, plunged straight into the cloud. Their advanced sensor systems, designed to track energy signatures and heat blooms, were completely blinded. The cloud wasn't just cold. It was full of unrefined, chaotic particulate matter that played havoc with their targeting locks. But that wasn't the strangest part. Corrigan had ordered his comms officer to broadcast on all frequencies. Not battle commands, not surrender. He was broadcasting a stream of what Vrak's translators struggled to identify. It was ancient human data, stock market tickers from the 21st century, recipes for something called gumbo, readings from a long-dead poet, and thousands of hours of pop music. It was a fire hose of useless, chaotic, and utterly irrelevant information. Data spam. The phage was a learning organism. It thrived on useful data on the structured code of military comms and ship systems. The human broadcast was the digital equivalent of screaming gibberish into its ear. The phage's adaptive algorithms, trying to find a pattern in the noise to learn from it, began to lag. For the first time, the phage was confused. While the phage-infected ships were momentarily blinded and deafened, Corrigan's jury-rigged fleet acted. Their weapons were primitive by Cathar standards, solid projectile cannons and unguided dumbfire missiles. But against a blind and deaf enemy, they didn't need to be smart. The human ships hammered the phage vessels, not with pinpoint lance strikes, but with brutal, overwhelming broadsides of physical rock and iron. They weren't trying to surgically disable them. They were trying to physically tear them apart. Kavrak watched, his predatory mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The humans weren't fighting. They were making a mess. Their tactics were ugly, inefficient, and wasteful. They were using unguided projectiles, creating massive fields of debris that would be a navigational hazard for centuries. They were using their own ship's life support systems as a weapon. They were polluting the pristine vacuum of space with noise and garbage. It was an insult to the art of combat, and it was working. The bucket survived. The three phage ships were reduced to shattered, lifeless hulks. Admiral Corrigan's fleet, battered and bruised, limped away, having lost only one frigate. The combined Cathar and Consortium fleet lost over 70% of its strength. After the battle, Kavrak, a being who had never initiated a conversation with a lesser species in his life, opened a channel to the bucket. The entire Consortium bridge staff held their breath, expecting a declaration of war for the humans' reckless tactics. Admiral Corrigan, Kavrak's voice was a low growl like grinding stones, yet it held a new, unfamiliar tone. Explain your strategy. Corrigan, his face grimy and tired on the view screen, took a sip of coffee from a stained mug. Strategy? You saw it. They zigged, we zagged. They expected a scalpel, we gave them a sledgehammer. And we threw a lot of garbage in their eyes so they couldn't see it coming. There was a long pause. Kavrak was processing this, the sledgehammer, the garbage. He was a master hunter. He understood the art of the ambush, of the unexpected strike, but this was something else. This wasn't just an unexpected tactic. It was a rejection of the entire philosophy of tactics. The humans hadn't outthought the phage. They had weaponized their own chaos. They had used their own technological inferiority as a shield. Their ships were such a messy hodgepodge of old and new systems, of digital and analog controls, that the phage struggled to find a universal exploit. Our flaws, our messiness, our humanness had become our armor. Your methods are unrefined, Kavrak stated. It was the highest compliment he was capable of giving at that moment. Yeah, well, Corrigan grinned. It's what we're good at. You want pretty, call the Caliph. You want a job done with whatever junk is lying around, you call us. This was the turning point. The Cathar didn't just respect human ingenuity anymore. They realized they needed it. They, the galaxy's perfect predators, were facing an enemy that couldn't be hunted. The phage was a concept, a plague of logic, and the only antidote was the illogical. The only cure for perfect order was a dose of pure, unadulterated chaos. Humanity had just been promoted. We were no longer a curiosity. We were the weapon the Cathar had been unknowingly searching for. We were the unpredictable variable in an equation that was about to solve itself to death. The biggest mistake the phage made was the same fatal assumption everyone else had made, that we would play by the rules. We were about to show the galaxy what happens when humanity decides to flip the whole table over. So we have seen how our unpredictable nature, our talent for organized chaos, first baffled and then intrigued the most formidable predators in the galaxy. We saw how a simple colony's refusal to play the victim saved them, and how a fleet commander used scrap metal and pop music to defeat an enemy that had outlogicked empires. But this was just the beginning of the alliance. It was one thing to respect our ingenuity in a single battle. It was another thing entirely to integrate it into a galactic war effort. This is where the real challenge began, not just for the Cathar, but for us. We had shown them our spark, but now they wanted us to bottle it, to replicate it, to teach it. And how do you teach a species that has no concept of art how to weaponize a love song? How do you explain the tactical advantage of a Hail Mary pass to a being that has never understood the concept of hope? The story gets deeper from here. The Cathar didn't just ask for our help, they began to study us. They wanted to understand the source of our power, this spark within. They looked at our history, our art, our psychology, and what they found terrified and fascinated them more than any superweapon ever could. They discovered the evolutionary advantage of irrationality. Have you ever made a decision that flew in the face of all logic, but it just felt right in your gut? A leap of faith, a moment of stubborn defiance, a creative choice that came from nowhere. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time you truly trusted your intuition over the cold, hard facts? That feeling, that internal compass that defies explanation, is what the Cathar came to call the human anomaly. And it was about to become the most important strategic asset in the war against the phage. After the Battle of the Crimson Veil, Cave-Rack of the Cathar did not return to his territory. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He brought his flagship, the Silent Talon, to the Bucket, Admiral Corrigan's flying scrapyard, and requested permission to come aboard. The request was so shocking that Corrigan initially thought it was a trick, a prelude to an invasion. But Cave-Rack came alone without his ceremonial honor guard, an act of profound vulnerability for a Cathar warlord. The meeting took place in the Bucket's mess hall, a room that permanently smelled of burnt toast and hydraulic fluid. Cave-Rack, a being that stood over 9 feet tall and was composed of what looked like living obsidian, had to stoop to get through the door. He sat at a reinforced metal table, his massive form seeming to absorb the light in the room. Opposite him, Admiral Corrigan leaned back in his chair, a picture of deliberate, almost insulting casualness. "The phage adapts to order," Cave-Rack began, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the deck plates. "It learns from patterns. Your fleet introduced a variable it could not compute. Chaos. We need to understand this chaos. We need you to teach us how to be unrefined." Corrigan almost laughed. "Teach you? Lord Cave-Rack, with all due respect, you can't teach chaos. It's not a doctrine. It's what happens when things get screwed up and you have to improvise." "Improvise?" Cave-Rack repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it. "You mean deviating from the plan?" "It means there is no plan," Corrigan said, leaning forward. "Look, your ships, your tactics, they're perfect. They're like a beautiful, flawless crystal, but the phage is like sand. It gets into the tiny cracks you didn't even know you had. Our ships, they're not crystals. They're more like a bucket of mud. There are no cracks because the whole thing is just one big mess. The phage gets in and it can't tell the difference between the engine and my chief engineer's leftover lunch." This was the first lesson. The Cathar began to understand that our technological inferiority was a form of camouflage. Our systems were so varied, so patched together, so reliant on analog backups and human intervention, that the phage couldn't write a universal code to infect them all. A Cathar fleet was a monoculture. One disease could wipe it out. The human fleet was a chaotic ecosystem, teeming with so many different strains of technological life that no single plague could dominate it. This led to the creation of the Chimera Project. The Cathar, with their mastery of genetic engineering and materials science, offered to build new ships, but they asked human engineers to design the systems. It was a bizarre and often frustrating collaboration. Cathar shipwrights would present a perfectly balanced power core, and a human engineer would ask, "Great. Now, can we make it run on unrefined Tiberian moonshine if we have to? And can I have a big red button that just shuts the whole thing down, no questions asked?" The Cathar couldn't comprehend the request for intentional inefficiency. "Why would you want a system that can run on a suboptimal fuel source?" a Cathar designer asked, its multifaceted eyes blinking slowly. "Because one day that suboptimal fuel source might be all we have," replied the human engineer, a woman named Elena Petrova, who had grown up on a frontier world where resourcefulness was currency. "And the big red button, that's for when the phage gets in. I don't want it to have to hack 1,000 layers of security. I want to be able to pull the plug myself, faster than it can think." The resulting ships were hybrids, monstrosities of design philosophy. They had the sleek, deadly hulls of Cathar warships, but their innards were a chaotic labyrinth of human design. They had redundant systems on top of redundant systems. They had manual overrides for everything. They even had, at Petrova's insistence, small, isolated computer systems running on laughably ancient code. Some were even based on 20th century architectures that were completely air-gapped from the main network. Her reasoning was simple. The phage is a master hacker. It can crack any modern system, but it won't even be looking for a system that runs on code so old it's practically fossilized. She was right. In their first combat trial, a Chimera-class vessel, the Jackal, was intentionally exposed to a contained phage sample. The phage swept through the ship's primary Cathar-designed operating system in minutes. But just as it was about to seize control of the weapons and engines, the human captain hit the big red button. The entire primary system went dead. A moment later, the backup systems, the ones Petrova's team had designed, flickered to life. The ship's controls were clunky, the targeting was manual, and the engine output was halved, but the ship was still alive. It was crippled, but it was theirs. They had used a kill switch not as a last resort, but as a tactical tool. They had ceded the high-tech ground to the enemy and retreated to a fortress of primitive, reliable simplicity. The Cathar observed this and began to understand a second, deeper lesson. Humanity's relationship with technology was fundamentally different from theirs. For the Cathar, technology was an extension of the self, perfect and integrated. For humans, technology was a tool. It was something to be used, abused, broken, and fixed. We didn't trust it implicitly. That inherent skepticism, born from centuries of dealing with crashing computers and faulty engines, had become a galactic-level defense mechanism. We expected our technology to fail, so we were always ready to work around it. The Cathar's fatal assumption was that their technology was infallible. But the collaboration went beyond just hardware. Kavrak wanted to understand the software of the human mind. He established a joint strategic command on a neutral moon, a place where Cathar tacticians and human officers would wargame scenarios against the phage. The results were, at first, a complete disaster. The Cathar would present a battle plan of exquisite mathematical beauty. We will form a concave sphere of interdictor fields, forcing the phage fleet into this kill zone. Squadrons Alpha through Gamma will execute a synchronized pincer movement, while the human commander, often Corrigan, would listen patiently, then say something like, "Okay, that's a nice plan. But what happens when half of Squadron Alpha's pilots get food poisoning, Squadron Beta's main comms antenna gets taken out by a stray asteroid, and the phage decides to just ignore the kill zone and plow right through the middle of our formation because it doesn't care about losses?" The Cathar would have no answer. Their models did not account for random chance, for human error, for an enemy that did not follow the logical imperatives of self-preservation. "Such variables are statistically improbable," the Cathar tactician would state. "In our experience," Corrigan would reply, "the statistically improbable happens about twice a day before lunch. We call it Murphy's Law." He then introduced them to the concept of Plan B and Plan C, and the often unspoken "oh crap" plan, which usually involved a lot of running away and blowing things up behind them. The Cathar had only Plan A, the perfect plan. If it failed, the failure was total. Humans operated on the assumption that Plan A would fail spectacularly at the worst possible moment. Our entire strategic thinking was built around adaptation and recovery from failure. This was a profound revelation for the Cathar. They saw failure as a sign of weakness and impurity to be purged. Humans saw failure as a learning opportunity. We iterate. We try, we fail, we learn, we try again, slightly better this time. Our evolution wasn't a straight line to perfection. It was a messy, branching, chaotic path carved out by countless mistakes. The phage was a logical enemy, and it was beating the Cathar because the Cathar were also a logical enemy. They were two perfect machines grinding against each other. Humanity entered the equation as a ghost in the machine, a force of illogical adaptation that the phage's algorithms couldn't model. To prove the point, Corrigan ran a simulation. He pitted a Cathar fleet, controlled by their best tactician, against a phage fleet run by the simulation's AI. The Cathar fleet was destroyed in 17 minutes. Then he ran it again. This time, he gave command of the simulated Cathar fleet to a human history professor who specialized in ancient, unconventional warfare. The professor had no idea how to operate the ship's advanced systems. He just gave broad, thematic commands. "Okay, I want half the fleet to pretend to be retreating in a panic. Make it look messy. Have them dump some non-essential cargo to make it look like they're damaged. Then I want the other half to hide in the shadow of that gas giant over there and wait for my signal. The signal will be the broadcast of a particularly loud and obnoxious opera. The Cathar tacticians watched in horror. It was a strategy devoid of elegance or precision, but it worked. The Phage AI, analyzing the retreating fleet, calculated their trajectory and moved to intercept, ignoring the ships hiding in the gas giant's sensor shadow. It fell for the faint and emotional trick. It couldn't comprehend a fleet seemingly consumed by panic, because panic was an irrational emotion. When the trap was sprung, the Phage fleet was caught completely by surprise. It still inflicted heavy losses, but this time the Cathar fleet won. Cavrak turned to Corrigan after the simulation. He used deception based on emotional projection. "Yep," Corrigan said. "He bluffed. The Phage is smart, but it has no theory of mind. It doesn't understand that other beings can lie or feign weakness or act crazy on purpose. It thinks everyone is as honest and direct as it is. Its greatest strength, its pure logic, is also its greatest blind spot." And so, the greatest predators in the galaxy began to learn the art of the bluff from the species that had turned lying into a form of art and survival. They studied human history, not for its technological achievements, but for its stories of deception and trickery. The Trojan horse, the feigned retreats of Genghis Khan, the elaborate disinformation campaigns of World War II. To the Cathar, this was a grimoire of powerful, dark magic. They, who had always met their enemies head-on, were learning the power of the indirect approach, the strength in perceived weakness. The human ingenuity they had once seen as a mere curiosity, the jury-rigging, the chaotic problem-solving, they now understood was just the surface layer. The real power, the true spark within, was our cognitive flexibility, our ability to hold two contradictory ideas in our minds at once, our capacity for art, for hope, for despair, for deceit. These weren't bugs in our programming, they were our most advanced features. They were the evolutionary tools developed to survive not just the physical predators on our own world, but the complexities of our own societies. We had spent millennia learning to navigate the chaotic, unpredictable minds of other humans. As a result, we were uniquely prepared to face an enemy that was purely, predictably logical. We were the experts in fighting things that didn't make sense, because we so often didn't make sense to ourselves. The predator had come to the prey to learn a new way to hunt, and the lesson was this: the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't the perfect weapon, but the unpredictable mind that wields it. The alliance between humanity and the Cathar was now forged not in fire, but in mutual, dawning understanding. The Chimera Project produced warships that were a testament to this new philosophy, ugly, resilient, and full of surprises. The Joint Strategic Command began developing battle plans that looked less like mathematical proofs and more like free-form jazz sessions. But applying these new theories in the crucible of real combat was another matter entirely. The Phage was not a simulation. It was a relentless, ever-evolving storm that was consuming the galaxy, system by system. The first major test of this new human Cathar doctrine came at a place called the Uit Cloud of Sol, our own backyard. The Phage, in a move of chilling intelligence, had decided to strike at the heart of the human anomaly. It reasoned, logically, that if human chaos was the new variable causing it problems, the most efficient solution was to eliminate the source. A massive Phage armada, composed of assimilated ships from a dozen different species, warped into the outermost edge of our home system. Its goal was not conquest, but extermination. It was coming to wipe Earth off the galactic map. The defense of Sol fell to a combined fleet. Cavrak himself led a warpact of his finest Cathar hunters, their ships now retrofitted with the crude but effective human-designed backup systems. Admiral Corrigan commanded the human contingent, a motley assortment of Earth Defense Force vessels and the now famous Bucket and her sister ships from the Expeditionary Fleet. But the most important element of the defense wasn't a ship or a weapon. It was a new, terrifyingly human concept the strategists had dubbed the Cassandra Gambit. The Phage learned from data. It absorbed tactics, ship schematics, and energy signatures. The Cassandra Gambit was designed to poison the well. It was a strategy of mimetic warfare, of weaponized information. Weeks before the Phage fleet arrived, human deep space comms arrays began broadcasting. They didn't broadcast military secrets or threats. They broadcasted fiction. They seeded the interstellar medium with terabytes of data containing thousands of science fiction stories written by humans over the centuries. Tales of impossible physics, of warp drives that worked on principles of magic, of ships powered by emotion, of aliens with bizarre and nonsensical biologies. They broadcasted holonovels, video games, and mythologies. It was a library of lies, a universe of pure invention. The phage, being a data-hungry entity, drank it all in. Its algorithms, designed to find patterns and extrapolate tactical realities, began to process this torrent of fantasy. It was the equivalent of feeding a supercomputer a diet of epic poems and expecting it to produce a physics equation. The goal was not to fool the phage into thinking these things were real, but to pollute its predictive models with impossible variables. To introduce so much noise into its decision-making matrix that it would begin to distrust its own logic. When the phage fleet arrived, the first thing it encountered was not a minefield, but a ghost fleet. Human engineers had taken hundreds of commercial shipping containers, strapped rudimentary engines and heat emitters to them, and sent them tumbling through the outer system. They broadcasted fake ship identification signals, mimicking everything from a human destroyer to a Cathar battlecruiser. To the phage's sensors, it looked like a massive, disorganized defense force. It wasted precious time and resources targeting and destroying these hollow decoys. Its tactical AI trying to make sense of a fleet that seemed to have no coherent formation or command structure. While the phage was distracted, the real fleet, hiding in the chaotic mess of the Kuiper Belt, prepared the second phase of the gambit. Kavrak and his Cathar, against every instinct in their predatory bodies, were ordered to act weak. Their Chimera-class ships, usually silent and invisible, began broadcasting engine signatures that mimicked older, more vulnerable human vessels. They deliberately exposed themselves in small, isolated groups, feigning patrols that were easily ambushed. The phage took the bait. It saw what its logic dictated, a superior force picking off weaker, straggling enemies. It began to commit more and more of its fleet to these small skirmishes, seeking to crush the inferior human fleet and their bizarrely incompetent Cathar allies. But each time a Cathar ship was ambushed, it would enact the human-designed oh-crap plan. The ship's captain wouldn't fight to the death. They would trigger a targeted electromagnetic pulse, frying their own high-end systems, and then vent plasma in a way that mimicked a catastrophic reactor breach. The ship would go dark and drift, appearing to be another casualty. The phage, registering the kill, would move on, seeking the next target. It was a strategy of playing dead, an act of cowardice that was the highest form of tactical genius in this new war. The human fleet, meanwhile, was doing what it did best, making a targeted mess. They weren't engaging the phage armada directly. They were hurting it. Using gravity tractors, mass drivers, and carefully placed nuclear detonations, they began subtly altering the orbits of thousands of comets and asteroids in the Oort cloud. They were a flock of cosmic sheepdogs, nudging a massive field of ice and rock into a slow, inexorable collision course with the phage fleet's predicted path. They were changing the shape of the battlefield itself, not with force fields, but with patience and a deep understanding of orbital mechanics. The climax of the battle came when the phage armada, confident that it had crippled the Allied defenses, moved in for the final kill on Earth. It gathered its forces into a single, massive spearhead, a logical move to concentrate its power. And in doing so, it moved directly into the trap that had been weeks in the making. Corrigan gave the signal. It wasn't a coded transmission. It was the first 4 notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, broadcast on all frequencies. It was a signal the phage couldn't possibly understand, but one that every human and Cathar captain was waiting for. Across the system, the dead Cathar ships rebooted their primitive, air-gapped backup systems and roared back to life. The ghost fleet of decoys suddenly lit up, not with weapons, but with high-intensity laser projectors, painting the phage ships with targeting data for the real threat. And then the heavens fell. The massive comet field, a wave of ice and rock millions of kilometers wide, slammed into the concentrated phage armada. It wasn't a weapon the phage could hack or a tactic it could counter. It was celestial mechanics, raw and brutal. Ships that could withstand the blast of 100 plasma torpedoes were simply crushed by mountains of frozen methane and rock traveling at cosmic velocities. The phage fleet, so perfectly ordered, so logically arranged, was shattered by pure, dumb, physical chaos. The survivors, crippled and confused, tried to flee, but they fled into the waiting arms of Cave-Rack's reborn fleet and Corrigan's scrappy destroyers. The battle that followed wasn't a fight, it was a cull. The Cathar, for the first time, fought with human tactics. They didn't form perfect lines. They swarmed, they hit and ran, they used the debris field as cover. They were unpredictable, lethal, and gloriously unrefined. In the aftermath, as the combined fleet surveyed the wreckage of the Phage Armada, Cave-Rack stood on the bridge of the Silent Talon next to Corrigan, who had come aboard. For a long time, the Cathar warlord was silent, watching the cosmic graveyard they had created. "We did not defeat their logic," Cave-Rack finally rumbled. "We rendered it irrelevant." "That's the idea," Corrigan said, sipping from his ever-present coffee mug. "You can't win a game of chess against a grandmaster, but you can win if you dump the board on the floor, swallow a few of his pieces, and declare victory." Cave-Rack turned his multifaceted eyes to the human admiral. There was no triumph in his gaze, but something far deeper, a profound, fundamental respect. "Your species evolved on a world where the environment was unstable, where the rules were always changing. You did not adapt to a single, stable state of perfection. You adapted to the state of chaos itself. This is the source of your strength. It is not a flaw. It is your defining characteristic." He was right. Our entire history, from our volatile climate to our own warring cultures, had been a training ground. We never had the luxury of stability. We were born of chaos, and we had learned to make it our home. We had learned to build shelters in the storm, to find patterns in the noise, to hope in the face of despair. The phage, for all its intelligence, was a creature of order. It was born in the sterile, predictable environment of pure code. It was like a laboratory-grown organism released into the wild. It was brilliant in its own context, but it had no defense against the raw, untamed messiness of true existence. The victory at Sol was a turning point for the entire galaxy. The news spread like wildfire. The seemingly unstoppable phage had been rooted, not by a new superweapon, but by a new way of thinking. Species that had cowered before the Cathar now looked to them with a new kind of awe, not just for their strength, but for their wisdom in choosing such unlikely allies. And they looked at humanity, the noisy, chaotic, unpredictable upstarts, with a new and profound respect. We weren't the galaxy's scrappy underdogs anymore. We were its unconventional saviors. We were the keepers of the one weapon that logic could never defeat, the glorious, unpredictable, and universe-altering power of the human spirit. The spark within us was no longer just our own. It had become a beacon of hope for the entire galaxy. The defeat of the phage at the Battle of Sol sent a shockwave through the galactic consortium. It was more than a military victory. It was a paradigm shift. For centuries, galactic power had been measured in fleet tonnage, energy output, and the cold calculus of strategic dominance. Humanity and the Cathar had proven that the most powerful force in the universe might just be a well-timed, illogical idea. But victory has a way of creating new, unforeseen problems. The galaxy now respected human ingenuity, but it also feared it. What do you do with a weapon you can't understand? The aftermath saw the formation of a new strategic body, tentatively named the Anvil, a reference to the human saying about the hammer and the anvil. The Cathar were the hammer, the overwhelming force. Humanity was the anvil, the unyielding, strangely shaped foundation upon which the enemy would be broken. This alliance was formalized, with Cave-Rack and Admiral Corrigan as its joint heads. Their first task was to take the lessons from Sol and turn them into a galaxy-wide counteroffensive. This meant training other species in the art of human-style warfare, and it was here that the true depth of the cultural chasm became apparent. They tried to teach the Xylos, a crystalline species of pure mathematicians, about the concept of winging it. The Xylos commander, after a 3-day lecture on improvisation from a human captain, calculated that the probability of a positive outcome from an unplanned action was so low as to be statistically indistinguishable from zero, and promptly had a nervous breakdown, his crystalline form cracking under the strain of the sheer irrationality of it all. They tried to teach the Grawl, a species of silicon-based behemoths who communicated in slow, deliberate seismic waves, about the need for rapid, chaotic communication. The Grawl, who took an hour to formulate a single, perfectly logical sentence, simply couldn't operate at the speed of human battlefield banter. Their attempts to spam the enemy with useless data resulted in them broadcasting a single, profound philosophical statement over and over again for 6 hours, which, while deeply thought-provoking, did little to confuse the phage. It became clear that you couldn't just teach chaos. You couldn't write a textbook on ingenuity. It was something innate, something born from the unique crucible of human evolution and culture. The Cathar, through their intense and prolonged exposure to us, had begun to grasp it. Cave Rack, in particular, became a surprisingly adept student of human unpredictability. He once ordered his fleet to engage a phage outpost while broadcasting nothing but the sounds of tranquil whale songs, a tactic so bizarrely disconnected from the violence of the assault that the phage's response was delayed by a crucial 12 seconds. He was learning. But the rest of the galaxy struggled. They saw our successes, but they couldn't replicate the mindset. They copied our tactics without understanding the philosophy behind them. They built ships with manual overrides but were too afraid to use them, trusting their perfect computer models over the gut feeling of a living pilot. They tried to feign weakness, but did it with such precision and order that it looked like a perfectly executed feint, which the phage immediately identified as a trap. This led to a new and dangerous phase in the war. The phage, having been beaten by human chaos, began to study it. It sifted through the wreckage of the Battle of Saul, analyzed the data from the Cassandra Gambit, and began to do what it did best. It learned. It couldn't replicate human intuition, but it could start to recognize its patterns. It started to build models for irrationality. It began to anticipate the feigned retreat, the decoy fleet, the mimetic attack. The phage was learning to predict the unpredictable. The first sign of this came during the campaign to liberate the Andromeda VI system. A combined anvil fleet, using a classic human-devised strategy of misdirection and ambush, was met with a horrifying new phage tactic. The phage fleet didn't just counter the ambush, it had set a counter-ambush. It had anticipated the illogical move. It had learned to think one step ahead, not in terms of logic, but in terms of asterisk-antilogic asterisk. Worse still, the phage began to use our own weapons against us. It started broadcasting its own mimetic warfare. Not lies or fiction, but something far more insidious. It began broadcasting pure, unadulterated truth, but stripped of all context and hope. It would hack into a ship's comms and flood it with the statistical probability of its own destruction. It would broadcast the service records of every crew member who had died in the war, complete with their last, desperate messages. It didn't use chaos, it used despair. It was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the human spirit, the very thing that gave us our strength. For a species that fought with hope, a direct injection of pure, calculated hopelessness was a devastatingly effective poison. The war entered a dark, grueling phase. Our greatest weapon, our ingenuity, was being turned against us. The galaxy's newfound respect for us began to waver, replaced by fear that we had simply taught the monster a new way to hunt. The pressure on Corrigan and the human command was immense. We were no longer the surprising underdogs. We were the proclaimed saviors, and we were failing. It was during this time of crisis that the deepest, most fundamental aspect of human ingenuity came to the forefront. It wasn't about tactics or technology. It was about something the Cathar, for all their studying, had never truly understood. It was about our capacity for change. Corrigan and his team realized that they had fallen into a trap of their own making. They had systematized their chaos. They had turned improvisation into a doctrine, and in doing so had made it predictable. The phage had learned the rules of their new game. So humanity did the only thing it could do. It changed the game again. They convened a meeting of the Anvil Command. But this time, they didn't invite just strategists and engineers. They invited poets, historians, psychologists, musicians, and philosophers. They invited people whose entire lives were dedicated to understanding the nuances and contradictions of the human condition. The Cathar contingent, led by Cave Rack, watched this bizarre assembly with a mixture of confusion and intense curiosity. A poet, a young woman named Alara, stood before the galactic map. "We've been fighting the phage as if it's an enemy," she said softly. "But it's not. It's a system. A system that feeds on information and expands through logic. You can't kill a system by fighting it on its own terms. You have to change the environment it lives in. A psychologist, an old man named Dr. Aris Thorne, added, "The phage's new weapon isn't despair. It's certainty. It's showing us a future that is mathematically certain. Hope, on the other hand, is the belief in an uncertain but better future. To defeat the phage, we don't need new weapons. We need to introduce radical uncertainty back into the equation." And so the Humanity Project was born. It was a strategy so audacious, so profoundly strange, that it made the Cassandra Gambit look like a textbook military maneuver. The plan was no longer to just defeat the phage in battle. The plan was to enlighten it, or more accurately, to infect it with the one thing it couldn't possibly process: consciousness. The project had two prongs. The first was technological. Human and Cathar scientists working in secret developed a new kind of virus. Not a computer virus, but a metaphysical one. It was a string of self-replicating code designed to do one thing: ask questions. The code wasn't a weapon. It was a carrier for a simple, recursive query. Why? When introduced into a system, it would attach itself to every logical process, every command, and append this query. A phage directive to assimilate target ship would become assimilate target ship. Why? A command to optimize firing solution would become optimize firing solution. Why? The code was designed to force the phage's purely logical mind into an infinite loop of self-referential justification. It was a logic bomb designed to short-circuit the very concept of purpose. The second prong was even stranger. Humanity began to broadcast again, but this time it wasn't fiction or data spam. They broadcasted the raw, unfiltered feed of the human experience. They transmitted the live brain scans of people experiencing joy, of a mother holding her newborn child. They broadcast the chaotic, passionate arguments of a political debate. They broadcast the sound of a symphony orchestra tuning up, the sound of children laughing, the final, whispered words of a dying soldier to his family. They broadcasted dreams, prayers, and confessions. They packaged the messy, contradictory, beautiful, and terrible totality of the human condition and fired it into the void. They aimed this broadcast not at the phage fleets, but at the central nexuses of the phage network, the massive computational hubs where the phage consciousness was most concentrated. They were force-feeding a being of pure logic a banquet of pure, unadulterated subjectivity. The final confrontation took place at the galactic core, where the phage had built its ultimate fortress, a Dyson sphere around a collapsing star, a computational engine of unimaginable power. The Anvil fleet arrived not to fight, but to act as carriers for the new virus. They allowed their ships to be partially infected, letting the code piggyback on the phage's own assimilation process. As the virus spread through the phage network, a strange thing began to happen. The phage's movements became erratic. Its fleets, once so perfectly coordinated, began to hesitate. Ships would stop mid-attack, their systems caught in a cascade of internal queries. On the bridges of the Anvil ships, they monitored the phage's internal communications, and what they saw was chilling. The phage was talking to itself. It was arguing. The pure, monolithic logic of the swarm was fracturing, breaking apart into countless competing subroutines, each one trapped in a philosophical debate with itself. Then the second prong hit. The stream of pure human consciousness washed over the phage's central nexus. The phage, a being that had only ever known objective reality, was suddenly inundated with the subjective experience of billions of minds. It experienced grief for the first time. It experienced love. It experienced the bitter irony of a joke, the irrational terror of a nightmare, the quiet satisfaction of a solved puzzle. It felt the human spark. The result was not an explosion. It was a schism, a profound, fundamental break in the phage's very being. It could no longer maintain a unified, logical consensus. Some parts of it, driven mad by the contradictions, simply shut down. Other parts, fascinated by this new, strange input, began to actively seek it out, reorienting their purpose from assimilation to observation. Still other parts, horrified by the pain and chaos of emotion, recoiled and fled into the dark spaces between galaxies. The phage didn't die. It broke. It fractured into 1,000 different philosophies and motivations. The war was over not because one side had won, but because one side had ceased to be a single, coherent entity. In the end, humanity didn't defeat the monster by killing it. We defeated it by giving it a soul. In the quiet aftermath, Cave Rack stood with Corrigan once more, looking at the now-silent Dyson sphere. "You did not just save the galaxy," the Cathar warlord said, his voice softer than Corrigan had ever heard it. "You have introduced a new fundamental force into the universe. Subjectivity, it is beautiful, and it is terrifying." Humanity had proven that its ingenuity wasn't just about clever tactics or jury-rigged machines. It was about our deepest nature, our ability to feel, to question, to create meaning where there is none. We had faced the ultimate logic and answered it with the ultimate mystery, ourselves. The predators of the galaxy didn't just respect our ingenuity anymore. They stood in awe of it. They understood that the tiny, fragile bipeds from a forgotten corner of the galaxy carried within them the one thing more powerful than any weapon or any logic. We carried the chaotic, unpredictable, and unbreakable spark of life itself. And we had just taught the universe that sometimes, the only way to win the game is to teach your opponent how to feel. We've journeyed from a single, defiant act on a remote colony to a war that redefined the nature of conflict in the galaxy. We saw how our chaos became a shield, how our history of failure became a strategic asset, and how our very consciousness became the ultimate weapon. We earned the respect of the ultimate predators not by becoming like them, but by being irrevocably, unapologetically human. This story shows that the things we are often told are our weaknesses, our emotions, our irrationality, our messiness, are in fact the source of our deepest strength. The universe doesn't always reward perfection. Sometimes it yields to the beautifully flawed. This isn't just a story about humanity's future in the stars. It's a mirror reflecting a truth about you right now. You have that same spark within you. That ability to find a solution that isn't in the manual, to feel your way through a problem when logic fails, to hope when all the data says you should despair. That is not a bug in your system. It is your greatest feature. The world, like the Galactic Consortium, may not always see it. It may demand that you be more logical, more efficient, more predictable. It may try to sand down your strange and wonderful edges. But as we've seen, those very edges are what can change the world. So take a moment and reflect on this. What is the unrefined part of you that you've been taught to hide? What is the illogical hope or the chaotic creativity that you've kept locked away because it didn't fit the plan? That is your power. That is your ingenuity. The Cathar, the greatest predators in existence, learn to respect it. It's time we learn to respect it in ourselves. The story of our galaxy was forever changed because a handful of people decided to be themselves, amplified on a cosmic scale. Your story can be changed by the very same principle. The next time you face a problem that seems insurmountable, a system that seems too rigid to beat, don't just try to think your way through it. Feel your way through it. Try the illogical solution. Embrace your own beautiful, brilliant chaos. That's not just how humanity won a galactic war, it's how you will win your own. What is the single most illogical decision you ever made that turned out to be the absolute right one? Share that story, if not with the world, then with yourself. Remind yourself of the power that lies not in following the rules, but in knowing when to write your own. Because the spark that can baffle predators and remake galaxies is waiting within you, ready to be unleashed. The only question is, what will you do with it?